The first ball of the London season fell on a Thursday in late April, and Eleanor Graves stood where she always stood, which was nowhere anyone looked. She had been placed beside a column at the far end of the Mercer Assembly Rooms, close enough to the doors that the draught found her bare shoulders, far enough from the candlelight that her gown, already the color of weak tea, faded into the plaster behind her. Lady Whitfield had positioned her there with a single pointed finger and a sentence that did not require a reply. "Stay. Do not move until I send for you." Eleanor had not moved. She held her hands together at her waist, one thumb pressed against the frayed ribbon she kept wound around her left wrist, a pale blue strip of silk that had once marked her mother's place in a volume of verse, and now marked nothing at all except the fact that Eleanor Graves had once belonged to someone who read. The room turned and shone around her. 300 guests moved beneath 1,000 candles, and not one of them had spoken to her in the 40 minutes since she had entered on Lady Whitfield's arm and been deposited like a valise. She was the companion. That was the word Lady Whitfield used, and it was accurate in the way that calling a house a structure is accurate, which is to say it named the function and missed the person inside it entirely. Lady Whitfield had said it that afternoon while fastening her daughter's pearls, her voice carrying to where Eleanor sat copying letters at the small desk by the window. She is the companion, Cecily. One does not present the companion. One does not introduce her. She is there to hold my shawl and fetch my glass. And if anyone asks, she is the late Reverend Graves's daughter, and she is fortunate to have a situation at all. Miss Cecily Whitfield had said nothing in reply, which was itself a kind of agreement. Eleanor had continued copying the letters. Her hand had not shaken. The ink had not blotted. She had learned, in 2 years of service, to keep the surface of herself as smooth and unmarked as the paper beneath her pen. If you know what it is to stand at the edge of a room where no one turns toward you, you already know what Eleanor carried wound around her wrist that evening. She did not see the Duke of Harlow arrive. She heard the room change, a shift in the noise, a settling of attention toward the doors at the south end of the hall, and then a quality of silence that moved through the crowd the way a stone's weight moves through water, pressing everything outward from the center. She looked because she could not help looking, and saw a tall man in a dark coat standing just inside the doorway with his hands clasped behind his back and his face arranged into an expression that did not invite approach. He was perhaps 30, perhaps older. His jaw was cut clean and hard, and his eyes moved across the room with the kind of slow, deliberate sweep that suggested he was not looking for anyone in particular and would not be pleased to find them. The crowd parted for him the way it parts for rank. He walked through the gap without acknowledging it. Eleanor watched him for 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than she permitted herself to watch anyone. Then she lowered her gaze and pressed her thumb harder against the ribbon at her wrist and reminded herself that she was not a guest and not a woman in this room, but a function, a carrier of shawls, a fetcher of glasses, a body stationed beside a column to wait until she was needed. She did not see him pause. She did not see his gaze, which had swept the room once without stopping, return to the column where she stood, and hold there for a count of 4 before moving on. She did not see the stillness that settled into his shoulders, or the way his right hand came up and rested briefly against his chest, fingers spread over the breast pocket of his coat, as though pressing something flat there. She did not see any of it, because she was not looking, because companions do not look, because Eleanor Graves had learned to survive by not looking at things she could not have. His name was James Ashworth, and he was the 7th Duke of Harlow, and he had not attended a ball in 2 years, and the letter folded into his breast pocket was the last letter his younger brother Edward had written him, received the morning after the riding accident that had ended Edward's life, and James had never been able to read past the first line. The first line said, "I should have told you sooner." Eleanor knew none of this. She knew only that Lady Whitfield had straightened like a wire-pulled taut, that Cecily had been steered across the room toward the tall man in the dark coat with the efficiency of a frigate adjusting course, and that she, Eleanor, had been left beside her column in the draft, holding nothing but a shawl that was not hers and a ribbon that was. The second ball fell 2 weeks later, in a different house, but the same world. Eleanor arrived in the same gown. Lady Whitfield arrived in new diamonds. Cecily arrived in white silk with her mother's hand at the small of her back, and her chin lifted to the precise angle Lady Whitfield had spent an afternoon calibrating in the drawing-room mirror. The season was a machine, Eleanor had come to understand, and the machine had parts, and each part had a function, and her function was to be invisible while the machine worked around her. She was good at her function. She had been good at it since she was 24 years old, and her father had died in the small parish house at Netherfield, with £400 of debt, and a daughter who had been educated far beyond her station, and was now, by the logic of the machine, worth exactly nothing. She had sold the books first, then the furniture, then the piano, which had been her mother's, which had been the only thing in the house that still sounded like home. The debts had consumed 360 of the £400. The remaining 40 had carried her to London, where Mrs. Pemberton, an old friend of her mother's, had written to Lady Whitfield on her behalf, and Lady Whitfield had agreed to take her on for £30 per annum, and the understanding that Eleanor would be useful, silent, and unobtrusive. Eleanor had been all three for 2 years. She had held shawls and fetched glasses and read aloud from novels that Lady Whitfield selected and did not listen to, and copied letters in a hand so precise that Lady Whitfield's solicitor had once mistaken them for a clerk's. She had earned every penny of her £30, and she had saved 11 of them in a small tin beneath her narrow bed in the attic room at the back of the Whitfield townhouse, and she had not once, in 2 years, been introduced to a single guest at a single gathering. The second ball was held at Ashworth House. She understood this only when the carriage turned through the gates, and she saw the crest on the iron. And then, when they were shown through the entrance hall, and she saw the portrait hanging above the stair. The tall man from the first ball rendered in oils, younger and less guarded, with his hand on the shoulder of another man who looked like him and was smiling. A brass plate beneath the frame read, in small letters, His Grace James Ashworth, Duke of Harlow, and the Honourable Edward Ashworth. She looked at the portrait for too long. The smiling man's eyes were the same shape as the Duke's, and the smile on his face was the kind that suggested he had never once in his life stood beside a column and waited to be needed. Lady Whitfield placed her again, this time near the library doors at the east end of the ballroom. The position was worse than the column. The library doors were propped open, and the room beyond was dimly lit and empty. And Eleanor could feel the books at her back the way a starving woman can feel bread through a wall. She stood with her hands at her waist and the shawl over her arm and the ribbon pressed between her thumb and forefinger, and watched the room happen without her. It was there that the Duke found the child. Not found. Discovered. A boy of perhaps 6, in a nightshirt and bare feet, had wandered down from the nursery and gotten lost in the corridor between the library and the ballroom, and he had come through the library doors blinking and disoriented and afraid, and he had stopped in front of Eleanor because she was the nearest person who was not moving. His lower lip was trembling. His feet were cold against the marble. He looked up at her with the wide, specific terror of a child who does not know where he is and cannot find the person who is supposed to know. Eleanor did not think. She knelt. The gown protested at the knee, and the shawl slipped from her arm to the floor. and she did not care about either. She knelt and took the boy's hands, which were small and cold, and held them inside her own, which were larger and only slightly warmer. And she spoke to him in the voice she had once used to read to the children at her father's parish school, which was calm and low and absolutely certain of the world. "You are Thomas," she said, because she had heard the name spoken by a footman in the corridor. "You are Thomas, and you live in this house, and the nursery is upstairs, and I am going to take you there. Will you walk with me, or shall I carry you?" The boy said, "Carry me." And Eleanor picked him up, the way she had once picked up the parish children who fell in the churchyard and scraped their knees on the stone, and she held him against her shoulder, and his cold feet pressed against her arm, and she turned toward the library and the corridor beyond it. She did not see the Duke standing at the edge of the ballroom, 12 feet from the library doors, watching. She did not see his face change. She did not see the way his hand went to his breast pocket again, fingers pressed flat over the letter he could not finish reading, and the way his jaw tightened, and the way he took one step toward her and then stopped himself. She did not see any of it. She saw only the corridor, and the stairs, and the nursery door, and the maid who took Thomas from her arms with a flustered curtsy, and an apology that Eleanor waved away with a hand that had gone suddenly, inexplicably warm. When she returned to her post by the library doors, her cheeks were flushed. The shawl was still on the floor where she had dropped it. She bent to retrieve it and found that someone had already picked it up and folded it and placed it on the small table beside the door. She looked at the folded shawl for a long moment. The folds were precise. Whoever had done it had taken care. She pressed the ribbon at her wrist and did not permit herself to wonder. The third ball was Lady Ashton's, 3 days later, and something had changed. Eleanor felt it the way one feels a shift in weather, a pressure in the air that is not wind and not rain, but the knowledge that both are coming. Lady Whitfield had dressed her down that morning over a letter Eleanor had copied with a single word misspelled, a word Lady Whitfield herself had misspelled in the original, and the correction had come not as instruction, but as a long, steady stream of grievance delivered in the drawing room while Cecily sat at the window pretending to embroider. "You are not paid to think, Miss Graves. You are paid to copy. If I had wanted a clerk with opinions, I would have hired a man." Eleanor had said, "Yes, Lady Whitfield." She had said it the way she said everything to Lady Whitfield, which was with the surface smooth and the hands still, and the blue ribbon pressed hard against the pulse in her left wrist. At the ball, Lady Whitfield placed her near the refreshment table. It was the first time Eleanor had been stationed somewhere she might conceivably be seen, and she understood within minutes that this was not a kindness. It was a display. Lady Whitfield wanted the Duke of Harlow to see her daughter, and the refreshment table was in his sightline, and Eleanor was positioned as furniture, a marker to draw the eye toward the silk and pearl figure of Cecily, beside her mother, 3 feet to Eleanor's left. The Duke entered late. The room performed its settling again, that particular hush of rank acknowledged. He walked through the crowd with his hands behind his back and his face shut. He spoke to no one. He accepted no glass, no greeting, no invitation to dance. Cecily was steered into his path by a mother whose grip on her daughter's arm left white fingerprints on the silk. "His Grace," Lady Whitfield said, her voice pitched to Carrie. "You remember my daughter. Miss Whitfield has been so looking forward to this evening." The Duke looked at Cecily. He looked at Lady Whitfield. He said, "Miss Whitfield," and inclined his head. And the word was correct. And the inclination was correct. And nothing in his face or his voice suggested anything beyond the minimum that rank required. Then he looked past them. He looked at Eleanor. She felt it before she saw it, a quality of attention that had weight, that landed on her skin the way morning light lands on a window and warms the glass before the room. She raised her eyes. He was looking at her. Not past her. Not through her. At her. The way one looks at a person whose name one means to learn. He crossed the 3 feet between them. Lady Whitfield's face went very still. Cecily's hand tightened on her fan. "Forgive me," he said, and his voice was low and level, and addressed to Eleanor alone. "We have not been introduced, and I am told that is my failing. You were kind to my nephew at my home. I have not thanked you, and I should like to. May I know your name?" The room heard him. The room was designed to hear him. 300 people had arranged themselves into the precise acoustics of social attention, and the Duke of Harlow had crossed a ballroom to speak to the woman beside the refreshment table in the pale gown and the frayed ribbon, and every one of them heard him ask her name. Eleanor's pulse struck once, hard, against the ribbon at her wrist. Her mouth was dry. She could feel Lady Whitfield's fury the way one feels a fire at one's back, and she could feel Cecily's confusion, and she could feel the specific, terrible weight of 300 gazes landing on a woman who had been invisible for 2 years and was now, suddenly, seen. "Eleanor," she said. "Eleanor Graves, Your Grace." He held her gaze for a count that lasted longer than the words warranted. His face did not change. His posture did not change. His hand went briefly to his breast pocket, the gesture so small she might have imagined it, and then returned to his side. "Miss Graves," he said. "Thank you." He turned and walked away. He spoke to no one else for the remainder of the evening. She did not yet understand what his asking had cost him. You might. The days after the 3rd ball were worse than anything Eleanor had endured in 2 years of service. Lady Whitfield's anger did not arrive as a storm. It arrived as a slow tightening, a series of small corrections and pointed silences and rearranged duties that left Eleanor standing longer, sitting less, eating later, and sleeping in a room that had somehow grown colder, though the season was turning toward May. The letters to be copied doubled. The reading aloud was replaced by errands that required Eleanor to walk across London in shoes that had been worn thin at the heel. Cecily, to her credit, looked uncomfortable. But Cecily's discomfort had never once translated into a word spoken on Eleanor's behalf. And Eleanor did not expect it to start now. The word moved through the drawing rooms of London the way words do, which is to say quickly and inaccurately. Mr. Havelock, Lady Whitfield's brother, arrived at the townhouse on the 2nd day and stood in the morning room with a glass of port and a voice that carried to the corridor where Eleanor was polishing a banister she had not been asked to polish. "You cannot mean the companion," he said, "the quiet one with the plain gown. She is hardly worth noticing, Margaret. His Grace was being civil." Nothing more. Lady Whitfield's reply was too low to hear, but the silence that followed it was eloquent. On the 4th day, the Duke of Harlow called at the Whitfield townhouse. He was shown into the front drawing room. Lady Whitfield received him in her best morning dress, with Cecily positioned on the settee like a painting arranged for display. Eleanor was sent to the kitchen. She learned what had been said only from the housekeeper, Mrs. Clay, who had overheard through the serving passage. His Grace had asked after the household. Lady Whitfield had offered Cecily's company for a ride in the park. His Grace had declined. He had asked, in a voice Mrs. Clay described as very quiet and very particular, whether Miss Graves might be permitted an afternoon's liberty on Thursday. Lady Whitfield had smiled the smile she used when she was angry beyond the reach of her own manners, and had said she would consider it. Eleanor stood in the kitchen with her hands in the washing water and the ribbon loose at her wrist and the heat in her face that she could not, for all her discipline, will away. She pressed her palms flat against the cool stone of the basin and breathed. He had asked for her. By name. She did not understand it. She could not afford to understand it. Understanding it would require believing that the Duke of Harlow, a man whose rank placed him at the precise apex of every room he entered, had looked past the silk and the pearls and the carefully positioned daughter, and had seen instead a woman in a faded gown who had picked up a lost boy in a nightshirt and carried him to bed. Understanding it would require believing that she was visible. And Eleanor had built her survival on the understanding that she was not. The afternoon liberty was not granted. Lady Whitfield sent word through the housekeeper that Miss Graves's services were required on Thursday, and every Thursday thereafter. Eleanor received the message standing in the corridor outside the kitchen. And she nodded, and she pressed the ribbon, and she returned to the letters. On the 6th day, something happened that Eleanor could not press flat. She was crossing the entrance hall with a stack of Lady Whitfield's correspondence when the front door opened and the Duke of Harlow stood on the step, alone, without his coat, in the rain. He looked at her. She looked at him. The letters were heavy in her arms, and the rain was loud on the stone behind him, and the hall was empty, and the house was quiet, and there was no one to see them, and no one to report what was said. "Come inside," he said. His voice was low and level, and carried the same quality she had heard at the ball, the same specific weight. "You are standing in a draught, Miss Graves." She was not standing in a draught. She was standing in the entrance hall of her employer's house, holding her employer's letters, performing her employer's work. The draught was his invention. The command was not. She took one step backward. He took one step forward, out of the rain and into the hall, and the door closed behind him. And they stood 6 feet apart in the dim light of the entrance, and his shirt was wet at the shoulders, and his hair was dark with rain, and his hand was at his breast pocket again, pressed flat over the letter she did not know about. "You carried my nephew to the nursery," he said. "Thomas has not stopped speaking of you since. He calls you the lady who held his hands." Eleanor said nothing. Her throat was closed. "I had a brother," the Duke said, and the words were not a confession, but a fact delivered in the same level tone he used for everything, the tone that held its shape the way stone holds its shape under weather. "Edward. He died 2 years ago. A riding accident. I was meant to ride with him that morning, and I did not. Because we had quarreled the night before over a debt he could not pay, and I would not forgive. He went alone. The horse threw him at the fence near Harlow Wood. He lived 4 hours. I did not reach him in time. He stopped. His hand was still at his breast pocket. He wrote me a letter," the Duke said. "The morning before. I received it the day after. I have never finished reading it. The first line says, 'I should have told you sooner.'" The rain struck the windows. Eleanor stood with the letters in her arms and the ribbon tight at her wrist, and the understanding, sudden and complete, that the man standing in front of her was not cold. He was wounded in a place so deep that the coldness was not a wall, but a scar, and the scar had grown over everything. And the asking of her name at the 3rd ball had cost him something she was only now beginning to measure. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was steady, and her hands were not. He looked at her. His eyes were gray and clear, and held the particular stillness of a man who has decided something, and is waiting to see whether the world will let him keep it. "Eat something," he said, the words so quiet she almost missed them. "You look as though you have not eaten today." She had not. Lady Whitfield had sent her on errands before breakfast, and the kitchen had been closed when she returned. He turned and left through the front door, back into the rain, without waiting for her reply. Eleanor stood in the entrance hall for a long time after the door closed. The letters grew heavy in her arms. The ribbon pressed against her pulse. She did not move. She did not weep. She held herself together the way she had held herself together for 2 years. By keeping the surface smooth and the hand still, and the understanding that she could not have what she wanted locked in the place where it could not damage her. Downstairs, in the servants' hall, she heard a bell ring. Lady Whitfield, summoning her. She straightened her shoulders, adjusted the letters in her arms, and went. The week that followed was the week that broke her. Lady Whitfield had received word, through channels Eleanor could not trace, that the Duke had called twice at the town house specifically to see Miss Graves, and that his inquiry about an afternoon's liberty had been repeated, in writing, through his secretary. The machine of the season did not tolerate anomalies. A Duke who looked past the silk was an anomaly. A companion who was looked at was a worse one. Lady Whitfield struck at the evening meal, which Eleanor took in the servants' hall, and struck publicly, which was worse. She appeared at the head of the stairs as Eleanor was ascending with a tray of evening tea, and said, in a voice calibrated to reach every servant on the floor, "Miss Graves, you will return the tea to the kitchen, and then you will pack your things. Your service ends at the end of this week. I will not provide a character reference. A companion who attracts the attention of her employer's intended match for her daughter is not a companion. She is a liability. You may tell Mrs. Pemberton, if she asks, that you were let go for overstepping." The servants' hall went silent. Eleanor stood on the stairs, with the tray in her hands and the tea cooling in the pot, and the ribbon loose at her wrist, and the understanding that the last safe floor beneath her had just been pulled away. £30 per annum. £11 saved. No character reference. No family. No home. The parish house at Netherfield had been sold to pay her father's debts. The piano had gone to a family in Surrey who had no idea that Eleanor's mother had played it every evening until the evening she did not. Eleanor set the tray on the step beside her. She straightened. She looked at Lady Whitfield, who stood at the top of the stairs in her evening dress, with her diamonds catching the candlelight, and her face arranged into the expression of a woman who has won something and is confident in the winning. "I have been a good companion to you, Lady Whitfield," Eleanor said, and her voice did not shake, and her hands did not tremble, and the ribbon at her wrist was the only thing in the world that moved. "I have copied your letters without error. I have read to you without complaint. I have held your shawl and fetched your glass and stood where you placed me, and spoken to no one you did not permit me to speak to. I have done everything you asked of me, and I have done it well. And the only thing I have done wrong is to answer a man who asked me my name." Lady Whitfield's mouth thinned. The servants' hall remained silent. Eleanor picked up the tray, descended the stairs, returned it to the kitchen, and climbed to her attic room, where she sat on the edge of her narrow bed and unwound the blue ribbon from her wrist and held it between her fingers and pressed it to her mouth, and allowed herself, for the first time in 2 years, to weep. She did not know that the Duke of Harlow had received word of her dismissal within the hour. She did not know that Mrs. Pemberton, who had written the letter that secured Eleanor's position, had called on His Grace that same evening, and that the drawing-room at Ashworth House had been very quiet, and that the letter in his breast pocket had been taken out and placed on the table between them, and that Mrs. Pemberton had said, in her plain, sensible voice, "She has no one, Your Grace. If you mean what I believe you mean, the time to mean it is now." She did not know that the Duke had stood at the window of his study for an hour after Mrs. Pemberton left, looking at the rain, and that he had taken the letter from the table and unfolded it and read, for the first time, past the first line. "I should have told you sooner. You are the best man I know, James, and your failing is only that you believe you are not." She did not know any of this. She knew only that the last ball of the season was in 3 days, and that she would not be attending it, and that her name, which the Duke of Harlow had asked for in a room full of people who did not know she had one, would be forgotten by the time the candles were lit. The last ball of the season was Lady Ashton's again, and Eleanor was not invited. She was packing her trunk in the attic room when Mrs. Clay came up the stairs with a folded note and a look on her face that Eleanor could not read. The note was from Mrs. Pemberton. It said, "Come to the ball tonight. I will send a carriage. Wear what you have. It will be enough." Eleanor went because she had nowhere else to go, and because Mrs. Pemberton had been her mother's friend, and because the blue ribbon was still wound around her wrist, and because she was 26 years old, and had 11 pounds in a tin, and no character reference, and nothing ahead of her but the kind of silence that does not end. The carriage brought her to the doors. Mrs. Pemberton met her in the entrance hall, took her hand, and led her inside. The room was full. 300 guests. The same 300. The same candles. The same machine. Lady Whitfield stood near the center of the room in her diamonds with Cecily beside her and Mr. Havelock at her elbow. The Duke of Harlow was not yet present. A woman near the door leaned to her companion and said, in a voice that carried, "The companion." The one Lady Whitfield turned out. What is she doing here? Eleanor heard it. She had always heard it. She stood beside Mrs. Pemberton and pressed the ribbon and kept the surface smooth. The Duke arrived late. He entered through the south doors, and the room performed its settling, and he walked through the gap the crowd made for him, and he did not look at Lady Whitfield, and he did not look at Cecily, and he did not look at Mr. Havelock. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at her across the length of the room, across the candles and the silk and the machine, and his face changed in a way she had never seen it change. A softening at the jaw, a stillness that was not cold but held, the way a breath is held before a word that cannot be taken back. He walked toward her. The room watched him walk. Lady Whitfield's hand closed around Cecily's arm. Mr. Havelock set his glass down on the nearest table with a sound that was louder than it should have been. The Duke stopped in front of Eleanor. He did not look at anyone else. He reached into his breast pocket and took out the folded letter, Edward's letter. The letter he had not been able to finish reading for 2 years, and he held it for a moment, and then he placed it in his coat pocket, gently, as though putting something to rest. "Miss Graves," he said, and his voice was low and level, and carried the way his voice always carried, not because he raised it, but because the room was engineered to listen. "Miss Graves has consented to become the Duchess of Harlow." The room went silent. Not the silence of shock, though shock was in it. The silence of something being corrected. A ledger balanced. A verdict overturned in the same hall where it had first been rendered. Lady Whitfield's face lost its arrangement. The diamonds caught the light, and the light did not help her. Her mouth opened and closed. Mr. Havelock reached for his glass and found it empty. Cecily, very quietly, released the breath she had been holding and looked at Eleanor with an expression that wasn't anger, but something closer to relief. The relief of a woman who has been freed from a campaign she did not choose. The crowd stirred. Mrs. Pemberton pressed Eleanor's hand. A woman near the door, the same woman who had spoken the word companion, said to her neighbor, "Well, I suppose we were wrong about her." The Duke had not moved. He stood in front of Eleanor with his hands at his sides, and his face open and his eyes steady, gray and clear, and he waited. Eleanor looked at him. Her pulse was loud in her ears. The ribbon pressed at her wrist. She thought of the column at the first ball. She thought of the folded shawl at the second. She thought of the rain on his shoulders in the entrance hall, and the command that was not a command, and the boy in the nightshirt who called her, the lady who held his hands. She thought of her father's parish house, and her mother's piano, and the 11 pounds in the tin, and the 400 pounds of debt that had swallowed everything, except this ribbon and this name. "Yes," she said. "Your Grace." "Yes." He offered his hand. She took it. His fingers closed around hers, warm and certain, and the room saw it, and the room would remember it. And for the first time in 2 years, the machine of the season had produced something it had not intended, which was a woman standing in the light with her name spoken aloud by a man who had crossed a ballroom to learn it. Lady Whitfield left before the hour ended. She did not speak to Eleanor. She did not speak to the Duke. She collected Cecily and Mr. Havelock and her diamonds and walked out through the south doors into the night, and the doors closed behind her, and the draught she had always placed Eleanor beside was, for the first time, not Eleanor's to bear. That evening, after the carriages had gone and the candles had been snuffed in the Ashton ballroom, Eleanor sat in the small drawing-room at Ashworth House with a cup of tea she had not been asked to fetch and a fire she had not been asked to tend. The room was warm and quiet. Thomas had been brought down from the nursery to meet her, and he had looked at her with his wide, steady eyes and said, "You held my hands," and she had said, "I did," and he had climbed into her lap without being invited and fallen asleep with his cheek against her shoulder. The Duke sat across from her. His coat was off. His cravat was loosened. The letter, Edward's letter, lay open on the table between them, and the light from the fire caught the ink. And Eleanor could see the first line, and the second line, and the third, and the handwriting was confident and a little careless, the handwriting of a man who had believed he had time. She looked at the Duke. He was watching her the way he had watched her at the third ball, the way he had watched her from the edge of the ballroom when she carried his nephew to the nursery, the way he had watched her in the entrance hall in the rain, as though her name was something he had been searching for and had only just found. "Will you read it to me?" he said. His voice was low, quieter than she had ever heard it. "I have never been able to finish it." Eleanor shifted Thomas gently on her shoulder. She reached across the table with her free hand and picked up the letter and held it in the firelight and began to read. The blue ribbon at her wrist caught the light as she turned the page. Outside, the rain had stopped. The season was over. The machine had finished its work. And the silence it left behind was not the silence of a woman who had been forgotten, but the silence of a house that had, at last, someone in it, who read aloud, and someone who listened, and a small boy sleeping between them, whose hands had been held. "Thank you for staying with Eleanor until the fire was lit and the ribbon found its place. If her name settled somewhere in you, she would be glad of the company."